Do you need it? Or what's in the Slack chat then?
Go.
Hello, my name is Masa, and I'm a data scientist at Logojoy. And my main focus is using machine learning to generate graphic design assets.
My name is Andrew, and I lead the data team at Logojoy, where we use deep learning to create the experience of working with a graphic designer online. Today, I'm going to be facilitating our conversation.
My name is Gordon. I work here at ADA, where I lead the machine learning team. At ADA, we build machine learning models to help automate customer support. And today, we're really happy to host TDLS, and we're excited for this session.
And I'm going to present an interesting work on autoencoders and their interpolation. I hope you enjoy the session.
Okay. Now we're going to start. So this paper I'm going to present is a very interesting study on interpolations and autoencoders. So I thought it would be interesting for a lot of people also at TDLS that they are either interested in generative models or they work with them. So because of the characteristic of interpolation that we are going to discuss, interpolation is commonly reported in experiments about autoencoders, but despite its wide use, it's not well defined. So this work done with this group at Google Brain, they actually introduced a very interesting approach to formalize and also encourage interpolation in autoencoders. They also investigate whether there is a connection between interpolation and representation learning. So, that's fine. I think it's good. So I'm just going to go first go to the basic that we are going to use for the rest of slides. So just like a structure of autoencoders and then interpolation. And then after that, we discuss the model, which start with proposing an adversarial constraint regularizer. And then there is a benchmark task defined to test that regularizer. And at the end, also there are some metrics defined to measure interpolation quantitatively. And at the end, like after a short break, we go to the experiment result on both on synthetic data and real data, and just summarizing the points from the paper and also discussion point suggested by Andrew, the facilitator. So, okay. So, just basically, autoencoders are unsupervised learning algorithms that they try to map data to a latent space, and from there to reconstruct like an estimate of that input. And they try to measure the loss, how much information is lost when they are squeezing the data through that latent space, which usually has a smaller dimension than the input data. So an input data X is fed through an encoder F to get Z, latent vector, and then latent vector is passed through the decoder to make an estimate reconstruction of the input, which is denoted by X hat. So I'm going to use this notation also for the rest of the slides. So encoder and decoder are trained simultaneously to try to minimize a notion of distance between the input data X and X hat, which is basically the basic loss is like error square that try to measure the information loss in the latent space. So interpolation in autoencoder means that decoder tries to decode the mixture of two latent space. And usually this mixture is done by convex combination. And there are some autoencoders that they have shown the ability to semantically interpolate, but it's not clear why they show this behavior. And you can see what interpolation looks like visually, that we start from x1, encoded to z to 1, and this is x2 like decoded from Z to vector, and then these are the intermediate interpolated data points. So why is it even important to look at interpolation? Why do you even care to look at it? So there are lots of reports on the autoencoders and their performance that they actually show the interpolation. So it's kind of like a qualitative measurement to see how actually autoencoders are performing. So the intuition behind that is that if you're able to smoothly interpolate through the latent space, that means the autoencoder has uncovered the structure in the data. So a successful interpolation can suggest that the more semantic data points are clustered together, which it can suggest that there may be a connection between representation learning and interpolation. And another reason is that if interpolation is very smooth and the model is able to disentangle different features in the data set, we can use it for creating new data points. For example, for like a set of faces, if we start from x1 and x2, and if model is able to disentangle the features of different part of the face, in the intermediate points, it can combine them together and also makes like a very realistic image. Yep.
What is meant by semantic?
So that's actually, semantic is very unclear. So it's very, I'm going to go through what is the problem with that. Yeah. So ideally, we want to tune alpha from 0 to 1 and see that the images from two endpoints from x1 to x2 progressively become more similar to the endpoint and less similar to the start point. So that's the definition of ideal interpolation. Yep.
When we start with the fish with the same?
Pardon?
When we started off, we had the same image on both the sides.
No, so x1 and x2, they are different. So, yeah. No. So how can we measure interpolation? So there are two issues with interpolation. So because it's not very well-defined concept, so the notion of, it relies on the notion of semantically meaningful, which is not really defined, and always depends on the problem what semantic means in a different data set and a model. And the other one is that there is no objective in the autoencoder structure that encourages good interpolation. So there is nothing known beforehand that why some autoencoders actually have good interpolation.
And just to make a point on semantically meaningful combination, when the authors are talking about this in the paper, they're usually meaning, does the interpolation map to some features in the data? So for instance, eye color, if it was face data, or like facial hair if it was face data. Something that a human observer would be able to see and make sense of.
Yeah, it's very visual, yeah. So the purpose of this work then is that they try to formalize and encourage interpolation, also to test if there is a connection between interpolation and representation learning by these 4 contributions. First, that they propose a regularizer to try to encourage high-quality interpolation in autoencoders. Second is that they also define a benchmark to test the regularizer. And on the experiment part, they also try to use this on a few data sets to try to see if actually that regularizer actually improves the interpolation quality. And at the end, they also tested with a classifier to see if it's also improving autoencoder performance. So, as was mentioned in the past slides, a high-quality interpolation should have 2 characteristics. So, first one is that the intermediate points should look very realistic, that you cannot say if it's interpolated or reconstructed or real data point. Second is that the intermediate point should morph between the 2 images very smoothly. So the second one is hard to codify and actually mathematically force it. What they do instead is that they propose a regularizer to actually force that to the autoencoder. And that is called adversarially constraint autoencoder interpolation, ACAI, which I'm going to refer as ACAI regularizer for the rest.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat those 2 points again? I wasn't really understanding that.
Pardon?
These 2 points, could you just repeat that again? Because when it says the intermediate points, I'm trying to think about the diagram that you showed earlier, which was
Like any of this, yeah?
this one.
Yeah.
And you're saying the point in the middle should be the data, which I would assume would be the left-hand side?
So they start looking less similar, like this one is more similar to X1, less similar to this, and slowly
So
changing.
sorry.
Yep.
Effectively what you're saying is that the 4th and the 5th point should look pretty much like the same as the first one, right?
It's kind of the middle, well, the middle one is like a decent combination of both, that it still looks like a shape, it has a shape, but it's kind of have characteristics of both X1 and X2.
Just a follow-up question on that is that how do they, like if they set this particular criterion that this should be met, how do they mathematically or how do they make sure that it happens? Because they won't be looking at all those images once it's going on, right?
So usually the way they actually report them is like they use that's the reason they done this study, because people always report this is interpolation between like maybe, I don't know, 6 data points, they went to X1 and 2, and they just like qualitatively look at it. So there is no way to measure it. It's like they just visually look at it. Yeah.
And to add something to your question about intermediate points looking like training data points, there's a common problem when you try to interpolate autoencoders where you get pixel fading. So you'll have the original image and the final one, and when you interpolate, you just get the original one fade into the second one.
Because noise is reduced, right?
Well, it's more there's not a well-defined latent space, so it's more just interpolating pixels. So those intermediate points, when you're fading pixels, they don't look like training set points because you have kind of a washout of pixels all over, where what they're trying to say is you have clear, distinct images at every step in the interpolation.
They don't have to look like the endpoints, just look like some shape like this one. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And so how do we measure the quality of interpolation? So the problem with interpolation is that, I think I talked about that. So yeah, so there is a regularizer and this per contribution we are going through, and so the model that I propose with that regularizer is that they pair an autoencoder with a critic model, and what the autoencoder does that is keeps producing reconstructed interpolated data points, and the interpolated data points are fed to a critic, and critic tries to recover alpha in the combination, the convex combination. And what autoencoder does is trying to fool the critic that alpha is 0, which means is a real data point. So they get trained simultaneously, and by the feedback it gets from the critic, it tries to autoencoder tries to make better interpolated data points. So then eventually critic output alpha 0. So the discriminator or the critic has 2 loss terms, and the first one is just recovering alpha from the critic, and the second one has 2 purposes. So the second one is the combination of real data points and also reconstructed, but by some weight. And so the first thing is that it makes sure that for real data inputs, alpha is always 0. So if we don't have the second term, so the critic never learns what a real data look like to output alpha 0. So this way is kind of exposed to real data to learn real data gives alpha 0. The second one is that it ensures that critic is exposed to realistic data when the reconstruction is very poor. So at the beginning of training, the reconstruction and interpolation are really bad. We have some output alpha, but before autoencoders start learning and making very good interpolation, we kind of give it a combination, some a combination of good real data points. So the critics start learning before reconstruction even start getting better and interpolation eventually. So this, they actually mentioned in their work that this second part was not very crucial to what they were trying. Basically, it was not crucial to enforce high-quality interpolation. It was more for stabilizing their model. And because their model never really collapsed to any bad solution, so the coefficient here, it was like very low. It's like gamma is like 0.2. They didn't really have to put too much of real data points in.
We had a question back here.
Yep.
I think we were wondering if you could describe that again about the critic part. So
No, here's, yeah, so basically,
This sort.
if I understand this correctly, the critic output a scalar. Is that correct? The scalar, which is the critic is trying to predict the scalar, which is the alpha that we're
Yes,
using.
yep.
Okay, so that's the first term. The first term, but then what is the second term then? The second term seems like you're just minimizing the output of your critic without any reference point. For the second term over here.
Like you give it like real data points with some reconstruction. So there is the input is, let's say interpolation x alpha hat is combination of x1 and x2. So there are the data set is 3 data points, x1 and 2, and x that can be any other real data points. So this way you give it some real data points to start learning what is, because at the end we want the critic to learn that if there is if the interpolation is really good, alpha is 0. So we have to give it some real good data points to just to be able to learn from it. The second term alpha is 0 because you don't have interpolation. The second term is not interpolated. So that's what it means to give 0 because this is the output 0.
Okay.
Isn't a perfect decoder encoder are identity function? So g of f should be I. So it's reconstructing the input in the output. So g of f should be x. G of f of x should be x, correct?
G of x.
G of f of x should be x. So if we put x there, it's like gamma x plus 1 minus gamma x.
Yeah.
Which becomes 1, and then d of 1.
So the way that they describe this in the paper is in the early stages of training, your autoencoder is making very poor representations, reconstructions of your data. So they're passing a poor reconstruction in, and as the reconstruction gets better, that term approaches a real data point. So that term, when you have a good autoencoder, should always be 0. It should go to 0 as you're getting there. But because your early reconstructions might be far off, it's kind of like what's it called in golf? It's like a handicap on the critic sort of to allow the model to catch up with it.
Sorry.
So do you mean that when you actually have more and more data, then the G and F are converging to inverse function of each other?
Yes, you should. So x going through f and then g applied to f of x should give you x.
Okay.
And the better your autoencoder is, the closer it will be to x.
Yeah. So everyone clear on this one?
There's one question.
Why did you do
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
So the first part depends on basically a pair x1, x2, and a number alpha. The second part depends on one input x. Can you elaborate a little bit how you trained? What kind of bags do you feed into?
I haven't looked at the code yet, but I think every time you're feeding the data through, passing it through the decoder, critic, is that some latent, some interpolation, interpolate, and some x that is not necessarily like x1 or x2. So it's just, I think, 3 of them together. So 2 of them make a mixture, and this is also passed through the critic.
Okay, so one training example will be like x, x1, x2, alpha. That's what you feed.
Yeah, that's what I think. But I think the detail, I'm not 100% sure, but I think if you look at the code, yeah. So also this is objective of the generator, and this is actually the part that has a big contribution for enforcing the interpolation. So the first part is just trying to find the error between the input x and reconstruction data point. And the second term is trying to fool the critic that alpha is 0. So if critic outputs 0, like alpha very close to 0, this is minimized. And anything that is bigger than 0 like gives a penalty to the generated loss function. So that's how they simultaneously are trained to actually minimize, to enforce alpha 0. So then the generators start making better interpolation to make sure that critic output alpha 0. So
It's worth
Yep.
noting in this model that they're not directly optimizing the latent space and the interpolations. They're working, the regularizer provides a signal to the autoencoder that should guide it to making better interpolations, but the interpolations are never optimized. It's not a direct thing.
yeah, it's not trying to force any structure on the latent space. So how can we now measure if this regularizer actually is improving interpolation? So one way of looking at it is that we can define a benchmark which has two characteristics. So first, that it should well define a correct interpolation between two data points. And second, it should let us to quantitatively measure interpolation. So the benchmark that is proposed in this work is auto-encoding 32 by 32 grayscale images of lines. So the data is 16 pixel line. And because it's a very simple data set, so the data manifold based on that data can be defined by just a single variable, capital lambda, which is just the angle of each lines with a reference. I think in their set of experiment, they don't say what is the reference. I think it's just positive x-axis, so any line, like any axis can be a reference. So based on this data manifold, a valid interpolation is from x and 2, like the intermediate points, like they smoothly have different angle from x and 1 and 2. And the second one is that the interpolation, valid interpolation is when actually interpolation takes the shortest path. I think one reason for that is that because for their older set of experiments, they pick fixed number of intermediate points. So if there is a longer path, it might be more abrupt changes between two intermediate points. I think another reason might be that because at the beginning there was this one. So I think it's more likely that interpolation goes through like a cluster of semantic similar points if it takes the shortest path. So it might give us better quality interpolation. So also we need to define metrics to measure this interpolations. So the two metrics they define is called mean distance smoothness. So mean distance is measuring how the intermediate points are realistic by comparing them to real data points. And smoothness measure how the morphing is smooth or not. So mean distance is 1 minus cosimilarity of intermediate vectors to the real line. But because it's hard to actually define a function or measure it continuously, so they define a set of D lines, sample from their real data point, like the syntactic data point that they made. So for example, let's say we have n minus 1 intermediate points, so between x1 and n, they pick a set of D line. So if we have, for example, 3 interpolants in the middle, so for measuring the mean distance, the way we measure it is that you find the closest line to that each of these interpolates, and you project them to that line. So you find a cosimilarity, and if minus cosimilarity is 0, so mean distance, it means like perfect mean distance. And for smoothness, again, they find the closest one, closest real data points to those interpolates, and then they measure the angle between each of them from like these 3 ones are the closest, so 1, 2, 3. And if they're all equally spaced and the angles are the same, smoothness is 0 because it's minus, like it's minus, so they measure the max of these angles and minus if they were all equally spaced, so that's how they measure it. I just tried to visualize it because it was lots of messy formula, so this was the best way to show it. So based on those metrics, these are the images like of, these are not real, like just some visualized like data points to show what interpolation look like based on those metrics. So the first one is just random data points. The second one is idea interpolation of those data points, the line points. So because it's all of them look more realistic to the real data points, also there is a smooth transition between 1 and 2. So this C, like the second, like the third one is like Andrew said, it looks like it doesn't, even the latent space doesn't have any structure. So it looks like there is only interpolating in pixel space because it's very messy and it's like ghosting out and in from 1 and 2 and there's no smoothness. So D, the lines look very realistic in the middle, but it's just a very abrupt change from 1 to 2 in the middle. E, they pick the longest distance. And the last one, it's smooth transition, but the intermediate ones are really, they don't have very good quality and they are very blurry. So just to show what they are trying to see visually. So this is also an example of what if we interpolate between 2 points in real data points and what we expect to see. So in real data points, the structure is messy, very messy, and the transition is like the first one is fading out and the second one is fading in. But if the latent space learned the structure of data, is like the intermediate is like look like the first one is morphing to another one, the second one. So let's take a quick break and go to this experimental result. I want to sit now.
Good job, Matt.
first question from online.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So we have a question from online. The question is, given an input data, the autoencoder creates several interpolation of the data at various layers of the decoder. Does the critic network discriminate all these layer level interpolations?
So like the autoencoder is just like encoder decoder, or they can be different. They're neural nets usually that they can have different layers, but the output is gone through all the layers. So at the end there's one interpolate output of all the layers. So if that answers your question. Yeah. Okay.
I have just a general question for building a scheme like this. Does it work better if you start the adversarial network off at exactly the same time as the network you're trying to optimize, or do you ever want to give the...
So you mean the autoencoder and critic? They are trained together actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it ever work better to give the one you're optimizing a head start over the adversary?
Like we train the autoencoder and then give it to critic, like already, because I think there's no, it's not trying to actually enforce latent space to give like specific structure, but still try to optimize it. It's kind of like, it's also forcing the autoencoder to make that space look like clusters, semantic data points, to actually have better interpolation. So
I think what Mas is getting at is, so sometimes in like GAN training, you might have the generator and discriminator with maybe a different learning rate, or you might find it works better if you train the generator a bit more. But in this, they didn't run into any training problems because they're dealing with autoencoders where the training is a lot more stable than situations where you have actual adversarial training and the only signal forward is coming from the adversarial relationship between two models. This you still have like basic autoencoder training where most of the signal is coming from the reconstruction. So they don't run into issues where you need to say pre-train the autoencoder to keep up with your critic.
Yeah, they actually ran the experiment with different parameters of regularizer, and they said it never collapsed to bad solution, so it was not an issue to stabilize the model. So.
The person online.
So when you mentioned, so at one time there's only one interpolation generated after one point, right? So then does that mean then you're doing it sequentially? So because when you have like two existing actual data point, then you're trying to interpolating between these 2 points. Then if you're generating one interpolation one at a time sequentially, so then does that mean that you have to feed your fake generated interpolation back to the model again to generate the next one, or how are you doing?
Like how do you make the sequence?
Yeah, exactly.
So the sequence is only by tuning alpha. So I guess they have different, I haven't looked at the code yet, but I think they might have different batches with different alpha.
So then you're still using the old existing true data to generate this whole path, but just by different parameters using the same model, is that right?
So I think they just mix you mix 2 data points, you pass them, so you encode them in the lane space, and then you mix them together, reconstruct them, and then, so what is your question?
Like first, yeah, like I was just like following up your point about using one existing point to generate one interpolation after one feed of data, but just how to, generate that path. Like, is it, because it's a sequence, right? So
So I don't think, so that's at the end that they actually train them all and they look at that sequence. I don't think we necessarily need to make that sequence passing through as a training part. So I think, yeah.
Feeding back the model using the generated data to connect the rule.
So you mean like making that sequence? So that's at the end when they already trained it. So feeding interpolants is different from at the end experimenting. After it's trained, like you can, I guess, tune the like alpha to make different interpolant to actually feed. But that sequence is only made at the end when you are trying to just like visualize what it looks like. So it's just mostly for, yeah.
You can think of the forward pass in the model as input data goes through the encoder, goes through the decoder, then you pass it through the critic, then you generate the interpolation for that input data, calculate all the losses, and then do another loop of it.
By the way, the person online said yes, that answered his question, smiling face.
Sure. This is not, oh, it is, sorry. So there are a few autoencoder structures that they use for testing their regularizer, and all of them have the same architecture. So all of them are they're made of basic blocks of 2 convnet, 3x3, and pooling layer 2x2. Depends how many layers they have. And then also critic architecture is similar to encoder. And latent vector for synthetic data is 64 for those line data. For real data, they use 256. And the lambda is a hyperparameter, so they keep it like 0.5. Atom optimizer they use for training, and the batch size is 64, and all the sample that they do for training is 2 to the power of 24. So yeah, so autoencoder gets the interplant, like output the interplant and send to critic, and critic tries to predict alpha. So these are the list of the autoencoder architecture they use. I'm not going to go through all the details of them because all of them can make an entire presentation. So the baseline is just like a vanilla autoencoder, just encoder and decoder. And these are the metrics, which each of them, so they are both metrics and also the visualized interpolation. So the first one that is just pure autoencoder, so it has the worst mean distance. So it means that the intermediate points are really poor quality. It's not, some of them are not even visible. And also smoothness. So the smaller they are, it means interpolation is better. So smoothness also is very poor. So the second architecture they use is a dropout. So what they did is that they drop out a few, like a portion of nodes in hidden layers, but it was not mentioned which layers in the autoencoder. So, and they figured that if they drop out half of the nodes in hidden layers, it has the best result. So you see that the mean distance is improving, but smoothness got worse. So there is they slightly look more realistic, but it's really abruptly changing and is not smooth morphing. Another model they tried, it was denoising. Basically, is adding noise to the input, and that model tries to actually remove the noise from the input. So they tried that with, I think, Gaussian noise. And what they observed was that latent space didn't even form. It looks like a pixel space. And you can see from the metrics that they measured. So mean distance is pretty bad. And also smoothness is worse than the baseline. Another architecture they use is variational autoencoder. And what basically does variational autoencoder, so the latent space is sampled. Yeah?
Excuse me, the point is here, the other architectures weren't, weren't given the signal to performing these measures that the hermetic of this article. So, for example, this one is trained to work in that way and also have better performed it that way that they want it to performed. So I guess how's the comparison?
Yeah, they just want to show that with like how they actually adding this to just autoencoder improves the interpolation. They are just comparing, saying the different structure. This is the interpolation without having any regularizer.
Okay, how about whether this interpolation would be good for our different applications that we have? If they can prove that point, then they can say, okay, if that's the case, then our model is better in comparison to other models. But without that, they have somehow suggested a measure, and then they have trained an architecture that somehow satisfies that measure, and they say, okay, we have these in other architectures.
Well, the nice thing about when you're using these generative models that work with visual results is you can try, and you see this a lot with GAN research, where the metrics to measure GANs are terrible, but you put two GANs beside each other, and we can tell which is the better GAN, right? You look at the results of it. And a lot of what this paper is saying is we can influence the interpolation through a regularizer. It's not really trying to say this is the best architecture you can have or this is the best for your applications. It's just saying by sending the signal given by a critic as to whether your interpolation is good or not, we can influence the results of the interpolation, and that might have implications for down the road.
Yeah, especially the first three one, I understand they are just like some architecture, but variational autoencoder and adversarial autoencoder, they actually try to optimize latent space. So maybe it makes more sense to compare these three, because these two, they try to optimize latent space.
The other thing is that in latent space, you really want it to be linear, and one of the metrics for linearity is interpolation. So if you can interpolate, it means it's linear, so you are getting that advantage as well.
I agree with, sorry, excuse me.
Powerful.
So, again?
Powerful.
I agree with,
Powerful.
yeah, there we go. That's a very good point, because first of all, like VAE and AAE, they're trained to maximizing like elbow or a different form of elbow, whereas the architecture they propose, you're pretty much like one is trying to estimate density and the other one is trying to measure. Basically, try to minimize, try to learn how to interpolate. Right? That's not fair. A comparison, basically. And it seems like to me that the picture quality from VAV actually looks perfectly fine, but I just don't know why the metric is that much worse than what they're proposing.
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that the AAE is faded out.
Sorry, I mean
compared
VAE.
to the
VAE.
Oh, well, I guess it's the abrupt translation
Yeah, so
in the third frame.
And also, like, I'm a little bit hesitant to actually call what they're proposing a generative model, because it's really not. Like, you can't really like generate stuff, right? You can start from a data point and then move a little bit towards one direction in the latent space, and then you get a new point, right? But like generative model, meaning that you actually have like a proper density model where you can sample from, and then turn that into an image or like a data that you care about, like VAE, right? You can sample from the prior and then generate a peer-back eventy, whereas in this case.
So could you summarize your criticism?
My criticism is pretty much like, to me, they're comparing like apple to oranges.
Maybe we can talk about this more during the discussion.
Yeah, so in variational autoencoder, again, the quality of the intermediate points is improving, but it's very abrupt change based on those metrics. And in variational autoencoder, because actually we have a prior to sample from that, it's kind of that enforcing a structure to the latent space. And that helps with this intermediate point. And another architecture they use was adversarial autoencoder, that the way that is trying to enforce the latent space to have better structure is that there is a critic model that tries to find whether an intermediate points if it's actually coming from the, like basically the output is that, is it coming from latent space or is it coming from that prior by using a critic paired with the autoencoder. The last one I'm not very familiar with, vector quantized variational autoencoder, just basically instead of having continuous latent space, they project the latent space to a set of vector. Let's say you want to have it on a unit disk, so then they pick that like set of vectors to optimize, and they claim this way. I haven't read the paper, all of the paper, but they say variational autoencoder basically ignores part of the latent space, so this way bigger part of latent space is getting optimized. And the last one is adding the regularization ACAI, and it looks perfect based on their metrics. So yeah, so it has the lowest mean distance and smoothness, and you can see by just visually comparing them that they observed it had the best result of all these structures.
Sorry,
Yep.
can I ask, how do the authors define mean distance and smoothness?
I can actually, like in formula?
Yeah,
I mean,
like
I can show you, but I actually had that just in case if anyone. So this is mean distance. They just saw this is a cosimilarity, and they measure all of them. And this is also smoothness. So they find that this is the max of all. These are like capital lambda. They find a max, and then this means like if all of them they were equally spaced, is each of them the angle would be 1 over n minus 1 if you have like n minus 1 interpolantes between.
Oh, and this measure was just specifically for that example with the lines? Like this particular smoothness?
Yeah, because that's the only data set, synthesized data set that they could actually have access to manifold, because other data we don't know what is the structure. But yeah, for any other real data, they don't have those metrics to measure. So let's go.
So did they share any other, I guess for these they didn't have the smoothness and like
No, they
results.
didn't.
Right, they just like,
Just
this is
visual.
just like eyeballing.
Yeah, exactly. So again, all this architectures, they use it for MNIST data, which has like very good quality. So you can see, again, like, I guess this ones, they don't have very, like even variation autoencoder, it has some clean intermediate points, but most of the intermediate points in using regularizer that they propose, it looks realistic, other than maybe this two. And another data set they did experiment, I think this is like very blurry, like plate numbers. This is really hard to compare because the quality of the input data is also pretty low, so it's hard really to compare, but they were trying to show a consistent behavior using their regularizer. So this, like if you just pick this part, for example, if you compare just this part together, like the last one has more clear intermediate points. Another one they use of AI because it's a face picture, has lots of features, and also you can see like different ones, like the intermediate ones. So it's hard to actually see the difference because like this is like obviously very blurry, but they say the last one is the best, but it's hard to actually look at all of them to figure which one is better. And one interesting part of their experiment that also still lots of question around that is that for investigating if there is any connection between having good interpolation and having like a better performance generating autoencoder, having better latent space. So what they did to test that is that after training the autoencoder with after training it like with different structure, they output latent code and fed it to a simple classifier and train the classifier with those latent vectors to see if what is the score, how what is the performance of autoencoders. And so this is suggesting there is a connection because, for example, for MNIST, they tried with different structure. And adding regularizer kind of says that if we have good interpolation, it also means that all these features are distangled. Most of them are distangled in the latent space. So that means that classifier can identify those features. So the 1, 2, 3, the 2 of the data set looks very consistent, like the result, but the last one that is C410, I think is very complex data set. So it looks like that one of the model denoising one had better score of mean distance. Oh, sorry, score of like classifying. So these are all like the result of classifiers. So.
Excuse me.
Yep.
What are the 2 classes in this case?
2 classes?
For the single layer classifier.
What are the specific of the
2 classes.
2 classes?
Yeah.
I don't think there are 2 classes. Like it depends on the data set. So how many classes?
You mean the 32 and the 256?
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's so for an ISD, it's 10 classes classifier.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, excellent.
Okay, so these are all the experiments they did. So it's just like at the end, like also in their open review, there was lots of question around like if it actually there is like mostly was between if there is a connection, why like good interpolation means that also there is good performance. So it was lots of discussion, and they at the end they say that they want to try this ACAI using it, actually pairing it with all these models to see how they actually can improve the like performance of them. So at least these are the, I think is again stuff. Next, please. Yeah. Okay. I think these are points I took from. Because I don't know, when I read that, like it gave me a better understanding of latent space in general. Because they, like around the, like adding regularizer and all the interpolation, everything, they have to go through deep in conversation about like all the encoders and generating interpolation. So that was that was the biggest point I took from this paper. And also they proposed this regularizer, and also another interesting part, like actually trying to define a benchmark to actually measure the performance of the regularizer, and also making those synthetic data and trying to define the manifold, data manifold. And then they studied if that actually, this regularizer improves the interpolation, also performance of this models. So these are the open discussion points that Andrew suggested. So the first one is, if we add that regularizer to variational autoencoder, would it help it better to just like would reconstruction get better? And actually that was also discussed in their open review. So basically, the purpose of this, my understanding was that the purpose of using this regularizer is that is trying to find if interpolants are very similar to good reconstruction. It doesn't try to compare the real points and reconstruction ones. So, and based on their discussion, variational autoencoders, they have good reconstruction. They have good interpolation. So this is mostly used for autoencoders. Like this, try to use used in a basic autoencoder that has very poor interpolation to try to improve it. So if anybody has any idea or conversation.
Actually, I have the same one. Does anybody have like good intuition of what's going to happen if you actually add another term to VAE? Because VAE, right, like, anybody has any intuition about what's going to happen?
Sorry, my thought. Oh, you go first.
You see a lot of difference between VAE and AAE.
Yeah, so VAE, you're maximizing an elbow. So it basically is a lower bound to your to the density of your data set.
Yes.
For AAE, so adversarial autoencoder, instead of using a KL term between your variational posterior and your prior to regularize your model, you're using an implicit regularizer that's parameterized by a GAN. Try to regularize your autoencoder. So that's the difference.
Yes, and that is a min-max regularizer. It doesn't always take the shape of a continuous distribution, but it is some kind of distribution.
Sorry, wait.
That the regularizer in A is a min-max regularizer. It's also a distribution.
Yeah. No, my question is what's going to happen, like, so in terms of the training dynamic for VAE, what's going to happen if you actually like add another term to the cost function? Because VAE actually has tons of problems when you train VAE by themselves, right? Like posterior collapse, and then your decoder could ignore the latent code. So there are tons of problem in terms of the training dynamics when you train such a model. So I'm just wondering, does anybody have any intuition what's going to happen if you actually add another term to the loss function?
But why do you want to add another term? So what does it do when you usually add another term to a cost function? Like, what do you try to achieve
by giving the latent space of a VAE better interpolation.
To do that, actually, there are a bunch of papers about like beta VAE, which try to play with the regularization itself, and then they achieve this with that beta.
But beta VAE pretty much like they solve the problem of beta VAE try to solve the problem of posterior collapse, right? It doesn't really help you to better interpolate in the latent space.
It does. Because it tries to distinguish, like actually you see that the latent becomes
it is trying to disentangle factors within the latent space, but if you actually look at the reconstruction quality from beta VAE, it's actually not as good as a regular VAE.
Reconstruction is not, but the latent is like more interpretable.
Sure. I mean, my question is, can you have better interpolation in the latent space without sacrificing the quality of your generative model? Right? And it seems like this can be done by applying this technique to a regular autoencoder.
Yeah, but so in VA, then if you add this term, it becomes like the elbow becomes meaningless. Like the higher, like the lower band, whatever. So when you add this to VAE objective function, what is the meaning of that? Like it becomes kind of meaningless. Then what are you minimizing?
I would say no, because first of all, to me, like the elbow term for VAE is pretty much the first term in their cost function, which is minimizing the altitude distance between your reconstruction and your X.
Yes.
Right.
But you
So
cannot justify it, like it's an outcome of some assumption that becomes that simplified kind of intuitive thing that you cannot go from this to that.
No, but if you just take away the critic, your autoencoder is still maximizing the elbow.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you're just like getting another gradient signal that will flow through your autoencoder. Yeah. Right. So it's not gonna hurt the autoencoder per se. Right, and I assume that's why a lot of people on OpenReview also raise the same question, right? Why can you not apply this to VAE?
What they say at the, they say at the end, for the next work, they actually want to do that, like add ACAI to autoencoder, evaluation autoencoder.
ACAI, right?
Pardon?
This is accepted at ACAI this year.
Sorry. No?
So when I'm thinking about applying this to VAE, it's, so like, it's showing here that in these examples, the latent space of this is better structured than the latent space of VAE. When you're dealing with VAE, one of the problems is the reconstruction. You're getting blurry reconstructions, even like in the beta V case, where you get a nice latent space. So I wonder what the value of applying this to VAEs is, especially in light of, say, the other points where it's how well does this work on more complex data manifolds that you'd be applying VAEs to, and how much is it adding just, so like you already have the prior that you're mapping your data to, how much does it add on top of that, or does it compete with that?
Yeah, although the blurriness come from the output of VAEs mostly because whenever people visualize the output of VAE, they just visualize the mean of the output, right? If you assume that your decoder is parameterized by a Gaussian. So that's where the blurriness actually comes from. If you sample from that Gaussian, you actually get like decent quality image that is not that blurry.
I mean, you're still getting blurrier results than if you used a different kind of model. Like you have a limitation in the mix of the KL divergence and the mean squared error as and the reconstruction loss as your objective.
So your conclusion is that there is no big difference between VAE and AAE and ACAI?
No, there's a big difference. Like I said, right, AAE and EAE, they're actually proper generative models. This is a like deterministic model. There is actually no randomness involved in this model whatsoever. And also, you can actually compute. Well, you cannot compute, but you can actually approximate the density with a VAE. But in this case, you can't, right? So this is not a. This might be good as a feature extractor in the sense that you train this, and then you use the latent code Z on some downstream tasks, but you cannot estimate the density of your data set, nor can you actually do proper like generation.
I have read this paper. Have they claimed that it's a generative model?
But they were complaining they're playing the generative model, right?
The question is then, so you're saying that there is no neural network-based generative model, right?
Sorry?
So then are you saying that there is no neural network-based generative model? So if it's, as long as it's neural network-based, then it cannot be generative model?
No, that's what I meant. Like, VE is a framework, right? And it has like probability distributions. You can parameterize the probability distribution with any tools that you choose, right? Like in VAE, the decoder is parameterized by a neural net, right? And just to come back to your point, like what we said earlier, right? Like if you want to show that okay, your model is able to learn better representation that will give you higher accuracy in downstream tasks, that's a valid point. But when you compare, like you know, like the visualization they're showing, they're comparing their model with model like VAE, right? I don't think that's a fair comparison. Like it's like comparing like apple to oranges. What I said earlier.
Would you allow me to rephrase you? So I'm not sure if I understand you correctly. Your point is that AAE makes a valid generator simply because it has a predefined prior. If that prior is reduced to 0, then it becomes an interpolator as well.
Sorry, what? No, I wasn't talking about AAE.
Because AAE has a probabilistic output. And that's because, the objective function of AAE.
Key becomes 0, it becomes like regular autoencoder. Is it?
But
yeah, which becomes like the same. Yeah.
No, but AAE also has a discriminator, right?
It does, but if you have like P is 0 or something deterministic, then that discriminator is almost nothing. Because the input, one of the inputs is coming from this generator part, which it's deterministic, it's doing nothing.
I would suggest that
take the rest of this offline.
So the second question, how does ACAI benefit models with non-visual result? Because like with different data set, I guess the biggest question would be, at least for me, with like what would be the metrics we can measure it, like if they are not visual. So I guess we have to, depending on different data, we have to define data type, we have to define a new benchmark and new metrics to measure interpolation. So, but I haven't looked into, like they just, in this paper they have only visual results. So if anybody has any thought on that. It's a very open question. And the last one is, how would ACAI extend to more complicated data sets rather than toy models? One of the the models, one of the data sets they use for their testing in the classifier is actually CFAR10. I think this is kind of very complex, that the results are kind of on the borderline. So they may have even tested it with interpolation and they haven't put the result there yet. So I guess it gets like kind of like, you see this one is the most complex one compared to the other toy data set. So it looks like the result, yeah.
Do you have a slide for the clustering results?
I don't have.
Okay,
yeah.
No problem. So in the paper, they also ran models through the different autoencoders, and then they did k-means clustering on it to see if there was any emergent structure that emerged that came out of the latent space. And you saw there was some relationship between quality of interpolation and clustering for the simpler data sets, for the MNIST and the house numbers. But for the CFAR, there was no structure at all. The clustering wasn't able to extract anything. It was 50-50.
Does the result show, clustering result actually show that you get like a smoother cluster compared to like a regular autoencoder with this regularizer on?
Yes. Let me pull it up. So yeah, they're referring to the quality of like how accurately it clusters the database. So you're getting more accurate clusters in MNIST if you have a better latent space, but when you go to CFAR, you don't have that anymore.
Is the cluster more like a circle or like a,
They don't comment on the geometric quality of it.
They do provide like labels to the cluster, or it's without?
It's just for evaluation.
Like t-SNE kind of thing?
Excuse, yeah.
Applying t-SNE over like doing t-SNE and then plotting the dots?
Yeah, like you could do that and it would give you a similar,
it
could give you a similar outcome.
But that's not what
they're
it is.
using k-means here.
I think we use it instead of like
Yeah.
So yeah, they don't have any report on interpolation on CFAR. So I guess it was where actually it was not, the regularizer was not really improving. So yeah.
The classifier performs better, right, in CFAR?
This one.
Marginally.
Yeah, so start like this one's.
It's okay, cool.
Yep. Any other question? Yep.
Sorry, I just want to mention one small detail. In the experiment, it seems like the author is being unfair because the A used a two-layer fully connected discriminator, and the idea present in this paper used the discriminator that is identical to the encoder. So I'm just wondering, do you think it's kind of unfair and why they can't be made even?
So Y is identical to encoder? That's what you...
No. The AAE get unfair treatment by only getting a critic consisting of two fully connected perceptual layers?
Let me. I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember the specific of the models, but I can.
Yeah.
I think if you.
I mean, that's something where you're hoping that the authors did their due diligence and picked a good architecture for it. It says in the paper that they tried different architectures and this was the one that performed best. So you're assuming they are being thorough in how they go about it. But the code is up there, right? Like their exact code that runs the paper is online. And these aren't computationally prohibitive experiments to do. Any one of us can open a Colab notebook and run it, and you do it in no time. So I'd say it's something where if it seemed like they were treating AAE unfairly, it wouldn't be hard to show that they were.
Any other discussion points? Sorry, could you stop from a separate discussion? No, sorry.
About the second question, actually, I had some points. Is that, my understanding is that this article tried to somehow force some structure to the latent space, which was somehow meaningful to the human being, for example. But about the second question that you had was really, okay, so whether we have other data types that the latent states can be, whether we can somehow force a structure which is meaningful to human beings as well. So the question is, okay, depending on the context, what would be meaningful to humans, for example, and also why do we need to force such a structure to the latent space, for example. Sometimes you just try to have a latent space in order to get some information later, but in here, for example, having a meaningful latent space is meaningful for us. It provides purpose. For example, one of the other things could be, for example, working with speech recognition and this sort of stuff, maybe, for example, having a meaningful latent space can be useful in other applications, but other than that, I cannot find anything which then
Can I answer that question with what I'm working on right now? Sure. So, interpretation, let's assume that you have 64 dimensions Z, so it's not like human interpretable. Right. So that's one. But the other thing, one application that I'm right now working on is that like you have lots of categorical data, which is like becomes like cursor, whatever, and then you create this Z latent variable, and then you want to vary like you want to add noise to this categorical value and see how they change. It's almost impossible in categorical domains. Like you have like one hot encoding, for example, or ordinal data. But when you have this latent space, which is interpolatable, when you add noise, then the outcome could be something meaningful. And when you look at it, you can say that let's say cities which are closer or these are meaningful, they become like closer together. So when you add noise to, for example, Toronto, you get like a city which is closer to Toronto. You won't get like Vancouver. I don't know, something which is in the data has a structure. So that's one example that I'm working right now on that. So the latent space becomes like like adding variable like the distances, whatever that you measure in numerical domain becomes meaningful to categorical value.
Thank you.
Actually, to follow up on that, do you have any like intuition about how like this will apply to the problem that you're working on?
I'm applying this.
So how are you gonna solve the there's like a discreteness, right? Mm-hmm. You cannot back propagate the gradient through
Gobble software.
So computerization. How big is the dimensional data? Like for each category.
I have like around 10 pictures. Like on average, like 500. It's around 500 like columns, one hex.
Yeah, okay, that would work.
Any other discussion points? Okay, if not, thank you to our presenters. And thank you for live stream and check out the other content on their channel.